The smell hit Emmett Slade before he even reached the gate. It was not a bad smell. That was the strange part. It was green and sharp and sweet all at once, like walking into a room where someone had crushed every living plant in Colorado and let the air fill with their breath. Sage and something darker, mint and something bitter, and underneath it all, a warmth that had no business drifting from a cabin that the entire town of Copper Creek called cursed. Emmett had come to deliver a message. The town council wanted the woman who lived here to stop dumping colored water into the creek. The ranchers downstream said it was turning the stones purple and killing the fish. Nobody else had volunteered to walk up the hill and knock on her door. Nobody wanted to talk to the Madwoman, so they sent the quiet one, the one who never argued, the one who had lost his wife 2 winters ago and hadn't said more than 50 words at a town meeting since. Emmett Slade was 35 years old, and most days he felt twice that. He ran a cattle ranch 4 miles south of town with nobody for company but 60 head of longhorn and a draft mare named Cedar who knew him well enough to find the barn without being told. He had come to Copper Creek with his wife Sarah in the spring of 1881, full of plans and the kind of hope that makes young couples believe that hard work is all it takes. Sarah had been the one with the gift for growing things. She knew every wildflower in the territory by name. Then the scarlet fever came through in the winter of 1882, and Sarah was gone in 6 days, and the garden died because Emmett couldn't bring himself to tend it without her. He stopped talking after that. Not all at once, but slowly, the way a well goes dry. First the laughter went, then the small talk, then the willingness to be in a room with people who looked at him with that particular softness that meant they were thinking about his dead wife. He pushed open the crooked gate. The garden beyond it stopped him dead. Emmett Slade had worked land his whole life. He knew soil the way a preacher knew scripture. And what grew behind Nettie Groves' fence was unlike anything he had ever seen. Rows of plants he could not name climbed wooden frames she had built from creek willow. Flowers he had never encountered bloomed in colors that didn't seem possible for March in the mountains. Roots as thick as his wrist pushed up from beds of dark soil that smelled like rain, even though it hadn't rained in 2 weeks. Every inch of ground was planted, tended, alive in a way that made his own dead garden look like a graveyard. And in the middle of it all, kneeling in the dirt with her hands buried to the wrists, was the woman they called Mad. She looked up at him. Her pale green eyes held no fear, no surprise, no apology, just a kind of weary patience, the look of someone who had been interrupted by strangers before and expected nothing good to come of it. "If you're here about the creek," she said, "it's elderberry runoff. It's harmless. Tell Orla Pickett to stop sending men to my door and start minding her own business." Emmett opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your garden," he said. "How did you get Cherokee Purple tomatoes to grow at this altitude?" Nettie Groves stared at him. In 3 years of living at the edge of Copper Creek, no one had ever asked her about her garden. They had called it witchcraft. They had crossed the street when she walked to the general store. They had thrown stones at her fence and whispered behind their hands and told their children that the woman on the hill would curse them if they wandered too close. She had come to Copper Creek in the autumn of 1881, a woman alone with a wagon of seeds and glass jars and dried things that nobody recognized. She bought the crooked cabin on the hill for $12 because nobody else wanted it. Within a month, she had cleared the scrub behind it and started planting. Within a season, things were growing there that had no business growing in the Colorado mountains. And within a year, the whispers had started. Orla Pickett, who ran the general store with her husband and ran the town's gossip without him, had taken one look at the strange garden and the strange woman, and decided that Copper Creek had acquired something dangerous. "That woman isn't right," Orla said, at every quilting circle, every church supper, every gathering where opinions hardened into fact. "No Christian woman grows things like that. No decent woman lives alone by choice." And so the town agreed, because agreeing with Orla Pickett was easier than thinking for yourself. But now a man was standing at her gate asking about tomatoes. Not accusing, not whispering. Asking, the way one gardener asks another. "You know plants," she said. It was not a question. "My wife knew plants," Emmett said quietly. "She taught me some before she passed." Something shifted in Nettie's expression. A crack in the wall she had built around herself, thin as a hair but real. "The trick is the soil," she said. "I mix creek sediment with ash and bone meal. The altitude doesn't matter if the roots stay warm." Emmett came back the next day. He told himself it was because he needed to report to the council about the creek water. He told himself it was because the trail past her cabin was shorter than the road. He told himself a lot of things that weren't true. The truth was simpler. He came back because Nettie Groves was the first person in 2 years who had spoken to him like a human being and not a tragedy. She didn't tilt her head when she talked to him. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't ask how he was holding up in that careful way that people ask when they don't really want to know the answer. She was outside when he arrived, hanging bundles of dried yarrow from the porch rafters. She didn't look surprised to see him. She handed him a cup of something hot that tasted like rosemary and honey and said, "The fence post on the east side is rotting. If you're going to stand around, you might as well fix it." He fixed it, and the one next to it, and by the time the sun dropped behind the mountains, he had mended half her fence line, and she had told him, without being asked, about her grandmother. Her name was Awanita. She was Cherokee. She married my grandfather when he was a trapper in Tennessee, and she brought the old knowledge with her: how to grow medicine, how to read the soil, how to make a garden, feed a family through any winter. Nettie's voice softened the way it only did when she spoke about her grandmother. "She taught me everything before she died. I was 16. I've been carrying it ever since. And Copper Creek doesn't want it," Emmett said. "Copper Creek is afraid of it. There's a difference." He thought about that on the ride home. Afraid of what they didn't understand. It seemed like every town he had ever known worked the same way. What they couldn't explain, they called dangerous. What they couldn't control, they called mad. The weeks passed. Emmett kept coming. He brought fence wire one day, a new hinge for her barn door the next. He repaired the 3 leaks in her roof that she had been catching in pots for 2 years. She taught him how to prepare a comfrey poultice for a horse's swollen leg. And when Cedar went lame in April, the poultice healed her in 3 days when the farrier had said it would take 3 weeks. She gave him tinctures in small brown bottles, one for the cough he couldn't shake since winter, one for the ache in his shoulder that woke him at night. Both worked better than anything Doc Pemberton had ever sold him. And on one evening, when the light was going purple over the mountains, she showed him the cellar. It was not what the town imagined. There were no glowing jars, no dark rituals. Just rows of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, labeled in her careful handwriting. Shelves of tinctures and salves lined the walls. Seeds stored in clay pots for next season. A medicine cabinet built by a woman whose only crime was knowing things that other people didn't. "This is what they're afraid of," Emmett said, turning a jar of dried chamomile in his hands. "People aren't afraid of the thing itself," Nettie said. "They're afraid of what it means if the thing works. Because if my medicine works, then everything Orla told them about me is wrong. And people would rather believe the lie than admit they were cruel for no reason." They didn't talk about what was building between them. They talked about soil, about root systems and rainfall and the best way to cure tobacco wilt. They talked about the dead, his wife, her grandmother, in the careful way people talk about wounds that are healing but not yet healed. They talked about Copper Creek and the people in it, and how a town could be so small that it had no room for anything it didn't already know. Orla Pickett noticed. She noticed Emmett's horse tied to Nettie's gate 3 mornings a week. She noticed the color coming back into Emmett's face, the way he walked straighter, the way he had started speaking up at the feed store again after 2 years of silence. And she decided that the Madwoman had finally done what Orla had always warned she would do. She had put a spell on a good man. The word spread through Copper Creek the way it always did, fast and ugly. By the end of the week, Emmett found that the butcher wouldn't sell him beef. The feed store owner looked away when he walked in. 2 ranchers he had known for years crossed the street rather than shake his hand. Someone left a dead crow on his porch with a note that said, "She'll do the same to you." "She's got him under her influence," Orla told anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, that woman will be the ruin of Emmett Slade, same way she ruined that creek water. Poison is poison, whether it comes in a bottle or a smile." Emmett heard what they were saying. He rode to Nettie's cabin that evening and found her sitting on the porch, staring at a stone someone had thrown through her window. Glass shards glittered on the cabin floor behind her. The evening light caught them like scattered teeth. "They've been getting bolder," she said, without looking at him. "Last week it was a note under the door. This week it's rocks." She picked up the stone and turned it in her fingers. "You should stop coming here, Emmett. I've been the town outcast for 3 years. I'm used to it. You don't need to join me." Emmett sat down next to her. He took the stone from her hand and set it on the porch rail. "My wife used to say that the quietest people carry the loudest truths." He looked out at the garden, at the rows of impossible green, at the life she had built from nothing but knowledge and patience and soil. "I spent 2 years being quiet because I had nothing left to say. You gave me something to say again." Nettie's eyes filled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not tears. She was long past tears. Something warmer, something closer to trust. "You're going to lose friends," she said. "I haven't had friends since Sarah died. I've had neighbors who pity me. That's not the same thing." She almost smiled. Almost. The fever came to Copper Creek in June. It started with the Pickett children, 3 of them, all under 10, burning up in the space of a single night. Then it jumped to the Baker household on the east end of town. Then the mining families along the ridge. Within a week, 14 people were sick, and the number was climbing. Doc Pemberton moved between houses with his black bag and his trembling hands, and every remedy he tried, quinine, calomel, mustard plasters, seemed to make things worse instead of better. The old doctor had a secret he had been carrying for months. On 2 occasions that spring, when his own rheumatism had gotten so bad he couldn't grip a scalpel, he had ridden quietly up the hill to Nettie's cabin and asked for her help. She had given him a salve made from arnica and something he couldn't identify, and it had worked within a day. He had never told a soul. He had never thanked her publicly. He had taken her medicine and his silence back to town and gone on letting people call her mad. Now he stood in the picket parlor, looking down at the youngest child, a boy of 4 whose skin had gone the color of old candle wax, and knew with the certainty of 40 years of medicine that he had nothing left. "There might be one thing," he said, and the words cost him more than Orla Pickett would ever know. "The Groves woman. She makes a tincture from willow bark and boneset. I've seen it break a fever when nothing else could." Orla's face went rigid. "I will not let that woman touch my children." "Then your children may die, Mrs. Pickett." The room went silent. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a horse whinnied in the June heat. Orla looked at her husband, who stood by the window wringing his hat. Her husband looked at the floor. The boy on the bed coughed, a wet, rattling sound that filled the space between pride and desperation. "Get her," Orla whispered, and the word came out like something being torn from her body. They sent a rider to Nettie's cabin. She came within the hour, carrying a basket of brown bottles and a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in cheesecloth. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say a single unnecessary word. She walked into the picket house, the house of the woman who had spent 3 years calling her a witch, knelt beside the boy's bed, and went to work. She brewed the tincture over the kitchen stove, her stained fingers moving with a sureness that came from 1,000 repetitions. Willow bark for the fever, boneset for the ache, elderflower to open the breathing. She measured by instinct, by smell, by the way Awanita had taught her to listen to the plant and trust what it told her. She sat with him through the night, changing his compress every hour, singing something low and quiet in Cherokee that Orla Pickett did not recognize and was too afraid to ask about. By morning, the boy's fever broke. By noon, he was asking for water. By evening, he was sitting up and asking for supper. Nettie went from house to house for 4 days. She barely slept. She used every tincture she had and brewed more from the garden that the town had called cursed. Emmett drove her in his wagon, carried her basket, held the lantern when she worked by candlelight in rooms thick with the smell of sickness and fear. He watched her kneel beside strangers' beds with the same focus and tenderness she gave her plants, and he understood that this was what she had been carrying all along. Not madness, not witchcraft, a purpose so large that a town of 200 people couldn't see it because they had never bothered to look. Together, they moved through Copper Creek like a tide, quiet and steady, and the fever receded behind them. Not a single person died. When it was over, Nettie walked back to her cabin on the hill and closed the door. She didn't wait for thanks. She had learned long ago that the people who needed her most were always the ones who had pushed her away the hardest. But Emmett stayed in town. He stood in the general store the next morning and looked at the faces of the people who had crossed the street to avoid him, the people who had left a dead crow on his porch, the people who had thrown stones through a healer's window, and he said the only words that mattered. "That woman you call mad just saved every sick child in this town, everyone, and she did it with the garden you threw stones at and the knowledge you called witchcraft." His gray eyes moved across the room, settling on Orla Pickett, who stood behind the counter with her arms folded and her face carved from something harder than stone. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for an apology. She didn't ask for anything. And you owe her everything. The store was quiet. Nobody moved. A fly buzzed against the window glass. Doc Pemberton stepped forward from the back of the room. His spectacles caught the light, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man confessing something long overdue. "He's right. I've known her remedies work for months. I was too much of a coward to say so. That's on me." Orla Pickett looked at Emmett Slade for a long time. Then she looked at the doctor. Then she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a bolt of blue calico, the good fabric, the kind she kept for special orders, and set it on the counter. "Give this to her," Orla said. Her voice cracked on the last word. "Tell her I said thank you." It wasn't enough. They both knew it wasn't enough. 3 years of cruelty couldn't be undone with a bolt of cloth. But it was a start, and in a town as small as Copper Creek, a start was sometimes all you needed. Over the days that followed, things began to shift in ways that were small, but real. A miner's wife brought a jar of preserves to Nettie's gate and left it without knocking. The butcher's son carried a load of firewood up the hill and stacked it by her door. 2 women from the church asked if she might teach them about the garden, not all of it, just enough to help their own families through winter. Nettie said yes to all of it, because that was what Awanita would have done. Emmett rode up the hill one afternoon in late June with the calico across his saddle and something he hadn't carried in 2 years rising in his chest. He found Nettie in her garden, kneeling in the dirt the way she always was, her hands deep in the soil, her wild dark hair falling across her face. She looked exhausted. She looked beautiful in the way that only people who have given everything look beautiful, stripped down to something essential and unbreakable. He tied cedar to the mended fence and walked through the gate. She looked up at him with those pale green eyes, and for the first time since he had known her, she didn't look like she was bracing for a stone. "Orla sent this," he said, holding out the cloth. Nettie took it. She ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling the quality, reading the gesture for what it was. She set it on the porch rail next to the stone that was still sitting where Emmett had placed it weeks ago. The blue cloth and the gray stone side by side, cruelty and kindness occupying the same small space. "Are you going to keep coming back?" she asked. "Are you going to keep letting me?" She stood, creek mud on her knees, plant stain on her fingers, eyes that saw things no one else could see. She stepped toward him and took his weathered hand in both of hers. His hands were large and sun-dark and rough from ranch work. Hers were smaller but just as strong, the hands of a woman who had turned soil into medicine and loneliness into a garden. "My grandmother used to say that the strongest medicine isn't in any root or bark," Nettie said. "It's in the person who shows up when everyone else walks away." Emmett looked at their hands together. 2 people the town had written off, the quiet widower and the Madwoman, standing in a garden that shouldn't have been possible, in a place that had tried to break them both and failed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The evening light settled over Copper Creek, gold and slow, turning the mountains amber and the garden into something that looked, from a distance, like the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing in the world. 2 people standing close, a bolt of blue calico on a porch rail, a stone beside it, and a garden growing wild and strong around them, proof that what the world calls madness is sometimes just love that nobody else knows how to see.